G'day, humans. Welcome to the safe space for dangerous ideas. What are we all doing here? How are we all talking to each other? What's technology doing to us? What kind of cognitive biases and thinking traps are we falling into? What's the point of it all, I hear you ask? And when my mind goes to such matters, I turn to the incredible Substack, or perhaps a very ultra-long Twitter thread written by today's guest, Gurwinder Bhogal, who sort of achieved fame by writing these extraordinary, soaring, hyper-intellectual, in-depth Twitter threads that might be 30 or 40 tweets long, explaining all kinds of different problems with the way that we think about things, our in-group and out-group preferences that shape the way that we relate to our community, both online and off. Absolutely fascinating stuff. I wanted to get him on the show, and if you want to hear more from him, he has an incredible Substack called The Prism, which is essentially a guide to modern digital life, but it's really so much more. I hope you enjoy as much as I did this dance through a wonderful, exotic, intellectual playground with the one, the only, Gurwinder.
Before that, I was in Luton, and
Right.
that was where
Basically London. We'll call it London, won't we?
Yeah, it's near London. It's
At a
about
stretch.
20 miles away. Yeah, it's about
At
20
least
miles away
people
from
who
London.
buy EasyJet flights think that it's in London.
Basically, it's kind of like an extension of London. London kind of just encompasses all the places around it as well, because it's just a sprawling megapolis. But Luton was quite an interesting place because it was a stronghold of a group of probably the deadliest jihadist group in the UK called Al-Muhajirun. And while I was there, I spent quite a lot of time researching this group. I actually even sort of went undercover as well. And I spent a lot of time talking to them and sort of getting to know them. And it was very eye-opening. I wrote a 30,000-word article about it, actually. So
Amazing. What did you notice? What did you learn?
So much. I mean, there was a lot, because this was something that I did over many years. But I mean, there was all kinds of things. I mean, one of the things that I found quite interesting was that pretty much all the narratives on both the left and on the right were wrong about Islamic extremism, at least in the UK. The left will claim that a lot of, or at least most Islamic extremism is a result of, geopolitics. It's like, Western neocolonialism, like people bombing Iraq or Syria or whatever. Whereas this was not actually the case, because a lot of the sort of hatred that I witnessed coming from these terrorists was actually not really directed at Western foreign policy. It was interesting because when I was there, it was around 2013, 2014. And this is when the Syrian civil war was really at its height. And at that time, the Islamists were actually complaining that the West was not intervening in Syria, because obviously Assad is Shia and he was slaughtering a lot of Sunni Muslims, and these were Sunnis as well. And they were like, why is the West not helping? So they were out in the streets and they were giving out this leaflet saying that the Western government is useless, that it's allowing Muslims to die. So I realized that, the hatred was not actually directed at Western foreign policy in the sense that, that they were angry with the West bombing certain countries, or as was sort of told by The Guardian and, the New York Times and all that. So on that sense, that side, it was kind of wrong. And another thing was that, a lot of the hatred was not really directed at any particular event. It wasn't, it wasn't sort of like the bombing Iraq or anything like that. It wasn't actually directed at any specific thing that the West had done. It was actually just the idea that the West was inherently immoral. And so this was something that was an eye-opener for me. But then also, I found that the right's narrative was also not quite correct either, because the right's narrative is that they're getting all of this information from the Quran, that they're sort of, it's all just religious sort of fundamentalism. But the interesting thing was that when I actually spoke to these people, none of them could tell me a single line from the Quran. They didn't know.
Right.
Yeah, they hadn't read it. And they basically, their entire worldview was not based on any scripture. It was based on what people were telling them the scripture was. And it was also based on the hadith, not on the hadith itself, but on certain prophecies that had been cherry picked from the hadith. So, for example, going back to the whole Syria thing, there were prophecies about a one-eyed baby being born in Damascus and that this would be the sign of the end times. This was actually a major reason for the rise of ISIS, prophecies like this. And what was very interesting was that they would ignore news reports that didn't fit their narrative, and then they would focus on these news reports that did. So there was this fake news that sort of circulated about a one-eyed baby being born in Damascus. And
I mean, it doesn't even have to be fake news, really. I mean, I'm sure
Exactly.
there are. It's a big city. There are one-eyed babies born all the time.
Yeah. In this particular case, it was later shown to be misinformation. But yeah, I mean, there easily could have been a one-eyed baby born. But I mean, this particular case was fake news. And it was interesting because there was no skepticism on their part at all. They immediately believed it. And I think this was actually even reported in a newspaper that they didn't actually, trust. And yet they just trusted this because obviously it was in line with their prophecies. And any information that was later sort of divulged, which showed that this was fake news, was ignored by them.
Yeah.
So they just, their entire worldview was just based on confirmation bias. Basically, they were looking for prophecies, obscure prophecies in the old books. At least they weren't actually, but they were taking the word of people who actually did. And then they were just sort of linking it to whatever they could in the modern world. And they were using that as justification for what they were doing.
That's fascinating because so much of your work today has to do with how we come to conclusions about the world, the kinds of epistemic traps that we fall into, the thought bubbles and echo chambers, and how we form our pictures of the world, the biases that we have. Was that informative to your thinking?
Absolutely, yeah. One of the things that I found when I was in Luton was that the people who were the most extreme were not actually the most alienated. And again, this is contravening sort of what the left-wing newspapers were telling us at the time, which was that these Islamic extremists were alienated from society, that they were essentially oppressed, that they were subject to discrimination, that they were living in impoverished areas, and they were forgotten by society. And so they were turning to something to fill the void. But this was actually the opposite of what was happening in Luton, because the most extreme people in Luton were not poor. They were actually middle class. They were not poorly educated. They were well educated. Most of these people were sort of architecture students, medical students, engineering students. They came from pretty well-to-do families. They were amongst some of the most well-off in the area. They had everything given to them by society. They had a good education. They had relatively, those of them who were not students had good jobs. They were generally well liked within their community. These were normal people. These were not sort of people who were living on the fringes of society. And I realized that, hang on a second, if you could give people the best education, you could give people a good wage, you could give people good parenting, good family, and they could still turn out like this. They could still become extreme. Then there must be some mechanism by which this is happening that's not explained by socioeconomic factors or anything like that. And that was when I realized that the problem was the biases that these people had, that they had pre-existing prejudices in their minds, and that they were, in a sense, destined to become extreme. And this is not to say that everybody, that a person is determined at birth whether they become extreme or not, but it's just that certain personality types do tend to navigate themselves towards extreme positions over time. And we see this, interestingly, this is another thing I found out, was that people who are extreme in one sort of area, so there might be Islamic extremists, if they leave Islam, if they become disillusioned with Islam, they're much more likely to become extremists of another kind. So they might become Islamic neo-Nazi extremists, for example. And I actually know that there was one guy called David Mayat, who was originally a neo-Nazi, and then he abandoned neo-Nazism and he became an Islamic extremist. And I've seen this with other people as well. I mean, you could argue that sort of someone who I used to look up to, Majid Nawaz, he was originally Islamic extremist. And then he actually, for a small number of years, he became sort of quite a reasonable person. And that was when I looked up to him quite a bit. And then his sort of extremist tendency kicked in, and now he's like this kind of COVID denier, sort of, character who believes in sort of some conspiracy that COVID was all fake and everything. And, he's putting out all this crazy stuff. So, one of the things is that...
Sorry, finish that thought.
No, carry on. No, sorry.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, the claim that many of the new atheists would say is that if you remove the theological scaffolding from a person's worldview, then you're not going to get them to do the kinds of things that Islamic terrorists do, that they need to have that foundational sort of underpinning of belief in, the way that the cosmos is set up and what their afterlife is going to look like in order to drive them to do things. And if it's not that, then, and we can sort of park the case of Majid, because Majid is not an example of a middle-class person who led a cushy life and just cherry-picked an ideology. He was in an Egyptian prison and he was persecuted for his beliefs, and Amnesty got him out. And so I regard Majid's swerve into La La Land as being an understandable psychological reaction to a sort of a PTSD-inducing trauma, which has made him suspicious of all forms of authority. But in the case of the person who doesn't have that background, who's just coming out of some middle-class existence in the UK, you remove the theological stuff, and what is motivating them to subscribe to an extreme worldview?
This is a very good question. And I used to be sympathetic to this view that it was actually religious underpinning, that was the reason for this. I was a big follower of Christopher Hitchens and, all of this stuff when I was younger. But I think the facts show that this is not the case. I mean, do you know which group is responsible for the most suicide bombings on the planet?
I think it's the Sri Lankan Tamils.
Yes. Yeah, the Tamil Tigers, yeah. Yeah, and the interesting thing about the Tamil Tigers is that they are secular. They're a secular organization, right? So this shows that you don't need religion to become a suicide bomber. You can actually do it for a political cause also. And I think what it is that, again, it goes down to the underlying personality. So some people are predisposed to having this kind of need for belonging, for believing in something greater than them. And it doesn't need to be a religious belief. It could be a political belief. And a need to also be a hero as well, a need to do good for society. And, you could argue that these are sort of certain facets of narcissism, this belief that you can change the world, that, you're the main character in this kind of movie, And what religion and political ideology do is that they become a sort of rationalization. They allow people to justify to themselves behaviors that they may just naturally want to engage in. This is not to say that, religion plays no part in bringing this about. I mean, obviously, without some kind of overarching belief system, it's very hard for somebody to justify suicide bombing, to themselves. I mean, the belief in going to a paradise with 72 virgins is obviously going to make it easier to kill yourself, because then you're not really killing yourself.
Who doesn't want 72 virgins? Sure.
Exactly.
I mean, I'll take them.
So these do play a part. I'm not saying that they don't play a part, but I think that if somebody wants to become a suicide bomber, they don't need to be indoctrinated into some kind of religious cult. They can do that themselves through rationalization. Again, a lot of the people in the UK who became extreme were originally extreme in some other way.
Right.
Like Khalid Masood, who's in Luton, he was an extremist. Originally, he was also extreme, but he was a pretty extreme criminal in terms of he basically headbutted somebody so hard that their tooth got stuck in his head. Because he headbutted them.
Well, that seems like an own goal, really. I mean, if you're going to headbutt someone that hard, you should be wearing a helmet for a start.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the
he was
good
a violent
thing.
individual.
I mean, the good news. The good news, I suppose, is that even if you go, If you go from a religious, a hateful religious delusion like Islamofascism to a secular one like neo-Nazism, the good news is that your view on the Jews can remain completely consistent. So, there doesn't have
Yeah.
to be so much of a difference between the two worldviews. I mean, this reminds me of one of the pieces that I love of yours is when you're talking about junk information as being distinct from misinformation or disinformation, but that the world at the moment is awash in a kind of information that you call junk information. This may lead us into that. Do you want to just articulate what that is?
Yeah. So it's been popularized now by the term brain rot. I think brain rot was the Oxford Dictionary Word of the Year in 2024. But I wrote about this a few years before and I called it intellectual obesity. It's pretty much the same thing. And it's the idea that, information is like food, basically. And in fact, this is not, it's not a metaphor. Like, there was some research that was carried out. I think it was at Berkeley, in which that it was found that basically information acts on the brain in a similar way to food. So what happens is that when we're hungry, no matter what we eat, it will make us feel good when we're hungry. If you're sufficiently hungry, you can eat anything, And the same is true with information, where if you're sufficiently curious, any information is going to make you feel good, basically. Even if it's bad information. Like the brain is not good at distinguishing good information from bad information. What do I mean by good information and bad information? So good information is information that changes you. It's information that's useful. It's information you can use. You can know that you're imbibing good information by the fact that you'll be different. You'll think or act differently after consuming it than you would before. Bad information is information that it could be harmful, but it could also just be useless. So it would be information you're exactly the same after consuming it as you were before. And when you think about it, a lot of the information that people find on their social media feeds nowadays is bad information by that definition. It's information that doesn't change them. They're exactly the same after consuming it as they are before consuming it. And the idea of intellectual obesity is that this junk information, which is like junk food, actually it causes health problems in the same way that eating too much McDonald's does, or, too much Pizza Hut or whatever. Just as junk food is filled with, additives, and it tastes good, but it's lacking in nutrition, and it's actually high in bad chemicals, which can make you overweight, can make you unfit, can lead to, insulin resistance and all that kind of stuff. Similarly, junk info tastes good. It makes you feel good after you've consumed it, but it's actually bad for you in the long term, because what it does is it essentially distracts you, and it keeps you thinking about things that you shouldn't really be thinking about, things that are not actually important to you, things that don't matter to you, and things that are not going to really be consequential in the long term. And people are filling their minds with this junk info. They're filling their minds with information that's not going to change them, that's not going to change anything. That's only making them feel good for a few minutes, but which is ultimately filling their heads with junk and essentially sidetracking their attention.
And I mean, the tricky thing, I guess, about this conundrum is that you just said that junk information, it doesn't enrich you, and it's of no consequence in the long term. The tricky thing is that it doesn't have to be both those things. A lot of information, it strikes me, that is unconstructive for people to consume at the rates that they do might be really consequential in the long run for like the fate of the planet. It might be that they're spending a lot of time online getting really, really agitated about Donald Trump or Gaza or climate chaos or something or other, all of which are very important issues, but which are not served either in their totality globally or in the individual experience of the consumer by being poured over and shared and exercised and commented on social media. So it's like we're sort of confusing or conflating the kind of worthiness of the information that we might be receiving with its utility.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things about the sort of digital space is that people sort of get cues of what's important based on what people are talking about. But people are talking about what they're talking about based on the cues that they've received about what's important. So it's kind of like a,
Right.
so it's like
It's a
a sort
snake
of,
eating its tail. It's circular.
yeah, exactly. So, what happens is that a few editors at newspapers will decide that they think a particular story is important. And then they'll basically make it the sort of headline. And then a few people on social media will start talking about it. And then that will lead to sort of this kind of cascade where you'll just get more and more people who will go on and they'll see other people talking about it. And then they'll start talking about it. And then more people join the conversation. And over time, eventually everybody's talking about it because they think, oh, everybody else is talking about it. But really, this is just something that snowballed from the choices of a couple of people. It's not actually the most important thing that's happening. And I always like to think about the contrast between what are people talking about now and what are future historians going to talk about when they talk about this period. And there's a big disconnect usually between what's important now and what the future historians talk. If you just look at sort of what people were talking about just 10 years ago and what people are talking about now when they look back at 10 years ago, there's this sort of disconnect there. And it's, sometimes you do see a unification where you have like, say 2016, for example. 2016 was a big event. It was the election of Trump, which was a sort of landmark sort of change in the culture. So yeah, at the time, a lot of people were talking about Trump, and now people, when they think back to 2016, they talk about that. But then again, like when you think about what were people talking about, again, COVID's another example of this, but when you go back to places like, 2012 or 2010, what were people talking about back then? Nobody really remembers. It was just mainly, just the issues of the day that everybody's forgotten. When future historians,
it was probably the housing crisis.
Yeah, there was probably some housing crisis somewhere going on, and just the news of the day people were talking about, and that was occupying most of people's conversations. When you look at what future historians or the historians of today are talking about when they talk about 2010, what they're talking about is they're talking about the rise of smartphones and the rise of social media, the digital revolution, and how this has completely radically changed everything. People were not really talking about this back in 2010 very much, So there's often a disconnect between what is actually important and what people talk about in the news. And
yeah,
this is essentially, I think, why we need to be careful about the topics that we spend our time focusing on, because a lot of the time it's just entertainment. That's what we're doing. We're engaging in entertainment. Most news is entertainment. It's there to act as a kind of social lubricant that people can just talk over certain issues and, in that sense, socially interact with other people. So, yeah, I mean, with going back to the whole intellectual obesity, one of the problems with getting your information from social media and sort of from the news headlines is that you can be fooled into thinking that certain things are important when they're not. You can be fooled into thinking that something is a gourmet meal when in fact it's just a fast food burger and fries, that's not going to really be good for you in the long term.
That's interesting. And I mean, it strikes me that it's not just the things that we're talking about that we have a blind spot over, that future historians will see that we can't. But it's also the way that we're talking about them. In other words, the boundaries that we're putting on the way that you're allowed to think about things. I mean, both of those factors are reasons why I left the legacy media, both because I didn't want to be chasing the daily news cycle of being told that I have to talk about things just because they were recent rather than, important. But also secondarily, that there's a kind of agreed upon envelope of acceptable discourse that when you stray too far from it, then you seem weird. But to someone 20 years ago or 20 years hence, it wouldn't seem weird at all. It was just that we're all inside a particular framework and we're looking at things through a particular prism. And there's a penalty for stepping outside the box. What's happening now, and I'd love to get your thoughts on it, is that I think people are feeling, if you think about the recent run-in between Douglas Murray and Joe Rogan over whether or not we should be platforming people who think that Churchill was the bad guy in World War II, for example. What's happening now is that people have spent so long, and this comes back to Margit as well, and people who have conspiracy theories about COVID, people have spent so long feeling like they're constrained by the norms of public conversation, and that the legacy media and other institutions are imposing such a strict taboo on the things you're supposed to say, you're allowed to say, that there's this backlash, this Trumpy, Elon-style, Farage-like backlash where it's like, oh yeah, watch me, I can throw shit at the wall just as well as anybody can, and there's not a thing you can do about it. How do you try to pave your way? How do you find reason in a universe in which you don't want to be contrarian just for the sake of being contrarian, but you want to be contrarian when it matters?
Yeah, so I think a lot of this sort of backlash is a result of there being too much of an active effort to suppress certain types of discourse. I think when you try to stop people from doing something, they become more sort of interested in doing that thing. This is a strange quirk of human nature, and it's known as, it's got various names, but in psychology, some people refer to it as the backfire effect. I've written a piece about it, calling it the imp of the perverse, based on an old short story. But it's this strange phenomenon that people have, where the more you try to get them to not do something, the more they want to do it. And over the sort of past, say, 20 to 30 years, there's been a gradual effort to limit certain kinds of conversation. People might refer to it as political correctness, wokeism, whatever you want to call it. But it was basically, you're not allowed to criticize immigration. You're not allowed to point out, for instance, that there are differences between the genders, in behavioral differences. During the pandemic, you're not allowed to say that COVID may have arisen from a lab, may have escaped from a lab. So there's certain things that were off limits for a long period of time. And what's happened is that the internet has allowed information to be transmitted, even if it's censored. So the old method of censoring certain kinds of information worked in the 20th century very well, because there were only a small number of outlets of information. There was a very centralized newspaper system. There were only a few big newspapers. There was a few TV channels. There wasn't really a big selection, and all of it came from essentially the establishment. You had to be a big corporation or at least a big business to be able to circulate the information, whether it was in print form or in broadcast form. But what the internet did was that it allowed anybody to basically say anything. And in that sort of system, censorship no longer worked. The old model of censorship no longer worked, because you can't restrict what the world is going to say. You can restrict what a few big organizations are going to say. But if you try to do that with the internet, it's just not going to work. There's always going to be someone who can just type anything that they want, no matter what you say. So the old 20th century model quickly became obsolete, but it didn't just become obsolete, it backfired. Because what happened was that when you try to censor something in a decentralized information environment, what happens is that knowledge of the censorship spreads quickly. Rather than suppression of the information itself, knowledge of the censorship spreads. And this can, lead to the Barbara Streisand effect, or the Streisand effect, as it's known, where this is named after, I think, Barbara Streisand tried to suppress information about her home. She'd bought some big home or something, and she wanted to suppress private details of her life and what she'd been spending her money on. And so she essentially tried to create a gag order, and this led to knowledge of the gag order basically spreading. And now suddenly everybody wanted to know all about Barbara Streisand's business. So, it basically backfired, and now everybody was curious to know what she was trying to hide. And this is what happens.
I never knew how interested I could be in Barbara Streisand's real estate until you had to make me not know about it. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so, so this Streisand effect is a very interesting thing. So basically what happens is that when you have a decentralized information space where anybody can post, and then you try to censor some kind of information, knowledge of that censorship spreads quickly, and everybody now wants to know why that thing's being censored. So it's very different to how it was in the 20th century. And it took the establishment, and when I say the establishment, I'm talking about, the sort of general managerial class. It took them a while to adjust to this. So they've now adjusted to this, or at least they're in the process of adjusting to this. But that for a long period of time, they were under the impression that all they had to do was censor information in order to remove it from society. And that doesn't work. The opposite happens. And so what we're seeing now with the rise of Trump and the rise of Farage and the rest of that, we're seeing this kind of populist backlash to this backfiring that occurred as a result of the managerial class just having no understanding of the modern digital age and trying to use 20th century methods to, restrict or control information in the 21st century. I think that now academics now are starting to understand that you can't change the discourse. You can't control the discourse through censorship anymore. It just doesn't work in this environment that we're living in now. So now they're looking at other methods, but, things like, sort of pre-bunking and all this kind of stuff. But we're still, obviously society lags behind technological changes slightly. It takes culture a few years to adjust to the technological changes. And we're still adjusting to this change in the way that information is transmitted, because it's only been really 30 years that the internet has been sort of widespread. Not even that, more like 25 years. And that's not really long enough. It's not really long enough for us to have adjusted fully to the kind of new world that we're living in. So I think that a lot of
you're using the word censorship pretty liberally there, in the sense that it's a natural thing for a society or a culture to try to always be renegotiating the boundaries of acceptable discourse and redefining what taboos are. And if there's a significant minority of people who think that the conversation around race or gender differences or immigration or whatever it might be is a little bit off and a little bit smelly and a little bit offensive to them, or demeaning or denigrating, or the way we talk about trans people or something, then isn't it legitimate for them to use the organs of popular culture and the institutions of governance not to throw people in jail for saying those things, but to instantiate new taboos about saying them and say, actually, no, it's not okay to be debating, I don't know, whether or not women aren't as good as men at doing engineering, or whether or not, we should be preventing Muslims from coming into the country. Those are topics that we want there to be a social penalty for talking about stuff like that. Otherwise, how would the taboos ever get renegotiated?
So the populist argument against that would be, like, who are they to decide what we are allowed to say? Why should they get to decide? What speciality do they have? What special information do they have that we don't, that allows them to dictate what we can say? And they will point to how these censors have got it wrong. For example, the lab leak hypothesis that was suppressed, and yet now it's the dominant theory. I like to think about this idea.
I mean, was it suppressed, or was it just that people who said it were unduly, perhaps unfairly mocked?
No, it was suppressed. On Facebook, you could have your account deleted and essentially completely terminated without appeal if you mentioned the lab leak hypothesis, for example. And that was just Facebook. There was also Twitter as well. Twitter also suppressed it at one point. This was pretty bad. And also you'd be called a racist, which is one of the worst things you could be called. And so, this is an example of how they got it wrong. And I like to use another example, which is the word retard. So the word retard was for a very long period of time considered offensive to the sense to the extent that it could actually get you banned. Like if you use the word retard on Twitter, for example, at one point, you could actually get your account at least suspended, if not terminated. And obviously polite society wouldn't want to deal with you. They wouldn't want to be friends with you if you use the word retard, because they'd think you were, mocking disabled people, mentally disabled people. Why I find this interesting is that the reasoning for why the word retard is offensive is because it was once used as a word to describe mentally disabled people, right? But what's interesting is the word idiot was also used in exactly the same way. And so was the word moron. And so was the word imbecile. These were all classes of mental disablement. And yet those words are completely acceptable and the word retard is not. And there's nothing to distinguish them in any other way. And so what happened is somebody decided at some point in time that the word retard should be offensive. And then it just it caught on and it became offensive because they had decided. And I just wondered to myself, why did this person get to decide that this word is offensive arbitrarily? Everybody just unquestioningly decided to follow this person's advice that this word was offensive. It became an emergent phenomenon. But nobody has a good reason for why it's offensive. Nobody can give you a good reason for why it's offensive. It's just because everybody else thinks it's offensive. So what we're seeing here is an Abilene paradox.
But isn't that just how norms evolve? I mean, I don't think it's the case that an individual made that decision and then decreed it. There's some kind of organic. I mean, there is certainly a phenomenon. I'll grant you that there might be a particular activist group that has a particular beef about some word, and let's suppose that media organizations like the BBC might be too cowed by some LGBTQIA plus activist group that encourages them to change the way that they talk about, I don't know, gender transition surgery, to call it gender affirming care, or to talk about sex as if it was assigned at birth, or that we all know that there's kind of a jargony sort of slogan way of talking that social justice types will adopt. And in that sense, there is something a little bit sensory about it, because it's coming censor-like rather about it, because it's coming from the top down rather than the bottom up. But it is also possible for norms to just change because there's a very passionate group of people who want to impose a new taboo around them. I mean, yes, it's arbitrary that the R word is bad and I have to call it the R word, and I don't call idiot the I word. At the same time, it's also arbitrary that we don't call females in the workplace honeysuckle and toots and slap them on the bum in the workplace, which would have been fine in the 1950s. They decided they didn't like it. They made a big ruckus when people did it, and we all sort of agreed and then moved on because there was all of a sudden a taboo against it. And 40 years ago, there could have been people in your position saying, like, it's totally arbitrary. Why aren't I allowed to call her babe in the workplace? Like, the babe is just an endearing word for a woman.
I would say that these are different cases, because in the case of, slapping a woman on the butt or whatever, that was something that was decreed to be bad because the people that the victims of it came forward and said, this is not okay. Right. And so, that's a very different thing from the word retard becoming outlawed. It wasn't a case that mentally disabled people came forward and said, we don't want to be called the word.
Well, it probably wasn't it? It was probably activist
not that
groups
I can,
who
I mean, I looked into
represent.
I looked into the how the word retard became outlawed, and there is no suggestion that this was a part of an active campaign by mentally disabled people to stop people from using that word. If it had been, then maybe that would have been different. But the fact is it was an arbitrary decision. This is what's interesting about it. Like I said, the word idiot, the word imbecile, the word moron, all of these words were used in an equal capacity to also refer to mentally disabled people. In some cases, these words were used to refer to people who were more mentally disabled than people who were traditionally regarded as retards. So, this again, who decided this? We don't know. You said that it's an evolving norm, but how did it begin? Who set off the chain reaction that led to, this becoming an outlawed word? And so for me, to go to the original point, so I use this to describe, an example of how a lot of what is censored doesn't often have very good reasoning behind it. And again, if you want a better example, the lab leak is probably a better example. If you give people the ability to decide what is acceptable for the rest of us to say, they're going to make mistakes. They're going to make big mistakes. And the populist right would argue that we shouldn't give any single group of people the power to dictate what is acceptable for the rest of us. That these should be, in fact, evolving norms. And that these should be things that happen bottom up rather than top down, and so and I kind of agree with this. Obviously, I'm not in favor of. I don't like the word retard. It can be good in a certain sense, but I would never use it to describe somebody who was mentally disabled. I would never use it under those circumstances. I call myself a retard. If I just get something wrong sometimes, I think it's a pretty good word in that sense. I use it in the same word that I'd use the word idiot or moron. I don't use it to attack mentally disabled people. But I think that the general sort of hatred for censorship that's emerged over the past 10 years is largely a result of these faceless individuals somewhere having the power to dictate what is acceptable for the rest of us to say without any real reasoning given. It's arbitrary. There's no real reasoning for it. It's like,
well, it's also, there's also, this reminds me of another point that I've read in your work, which is that the difference between sort of creating norms that have some rational basis versus creating norms whose job it is to demonstrate our own goodness or our fidelity or kind of put us in a moral hierarchy, in the sense that, when you just made the distinction between using a word and mentioning a word, this is something that linguists, are familiar with, to talk about, to have a conversation the way that we are about the acceptability of the use of a particular word and use the word in that context is very different from using it as a slur. This is something that we've all been forced to reevaluate with the N-word over the past 15 or 20 years. 20 years ago, it would have been possible to talk about, whether or not a white person can ever say that word, and you would have actually used the word when you're talking about it. Now we're being forced to essentially pretend that we can't tell the difference between mentioning a word and using the word in hate. And the reason for that, presumably, is not in order to achieve any real world outcome, except to demonstrate that we're signing up to be on the right side of history and that we've got the memo about how we're supposed to behave. So a lot of this stuff actually has less to do with how we want the world to look and how we think we should live as good people, and more to do with how do we signal to other people that we're on the right tribe and that our heart is in the right place and that we have status inside a certain social justice hierarchy.
Yeah. And this is exactly the argument that is put forward by the populist right at the moment, which is that it's all virtue signaling. That it's only words at the end of the day, and words only have as much power as we imbue them with. If we choose not to be offended by a certain word, then it loses its power. And I think this is a very convincing argument. Again, this is the case of the managerial class not having a good understanding of human psychology and their attempts to fix the world actually making it more broken, a backfire effect. And this is another backfire effect where what they do is they try to make a word outlawed by making it extremely offensive. But what that does is that gives the word more power. And the people that they actually want to stop from using this word use it more. Because it's they want to offend, they want to be based, and they want to go out there and offend people. And we see with Shiloh Hendricks, who used the word, I use the word nigger because I use it descriptively. I don't use it. I don't like to use the word N-word. I think that N-word is a bit of a cop out. So I'll use the word. So she used the word. Yeah. So she used the word nigger, and she's now close to $1 million in donations. She's got close to $1 million in donations from people for using that word. And so this is a backfire of what the managerial class intended. They wanted to make this word so verboten that people would never use it. But the opposite's happened. Now people are being paid. They're becoming millionaires for using that word. Right. And
yes. Yeah. It's completely bizarre. And in the realm of ideas, it reminds me, and we can move on from the question of censorship and taboos, but it reminds me a little bit of, you raised immigration earlier. And, one of the big sort of mistakes I think that the left has made over the past 10 or 20 years is to make it almost as taboo as the N-word to talk about the problems of integration of particular communities in multicultural societies. And by making it so taboo, we've given it a frisson of kind of sexiness to be anti-immigrant or to be xenophobic. And if it had just been a normal part of everyday conversation to talk about, all right, well, how do we integrate these people? What if they come from a conservative Muslim background? How do we, make sure that they're on board with liberal democratic values and that they're not sexist and so on? The insinuation that you might be more sexist if you come from a conservative Muslim community was regarded as so taboo that you couldn't have that conversation. So now you end up with entire swathes of, towns and cities in the UK and France and Germany, where the lack of integration is galling and is fueling a new right-wing backlash that could have been headed off at the pass if only we'd been able to have more open conversations about the challenge before it got insurmountable. I don't know if you want to comment on that before we.
Yeah, I just think that a lot of the sort of problems really come from good intentions, and I think that with the left, what they try to do is that with the example of not calling out Islamic misogyny, obviously they're trying to look after one group's rights. And, they think, obviously, there's a lot of what they would call Islamophobia. So they're trying to fight Islamophobia by preventing, criticism of Islam. But then by doing this, what they do is they create problems for another group, which is women. Women who are in Muslim societies are suffering as a result of this. If you're not allowed to call out Islamic misogyny, then Islamic misogyny gets a free pass. And what this results in is it means women can be oppressed with impunity. And so, this is one of the fundamental problems with the sort of left's approach to sort of engaging in this kind of identity politics, where oftentimes when they try to do good for one group, they're actually sacrificing another group for that. And they're essentially, again, you could say the same thing about trans rights, where when they're sort of advocating for trans rights, they're usually taking rights away from women to a certain extent. And so this is why I just don't think this is a good way to try to fix the world, to try to, improve relations or whatever between different cultures, between different demographics. I think, ultimately, and again, this is another example of managerial class having no understanding of human psychology. They think that, by, preventing criticism of one group, that they can actually make people more accepting of that group. But that's not what happens. The opposite happens. If you're not allowed to criticize one group, then people see that group as being favoritist. They see it being, as being favorited, sorry. And then, they're like, oh, why are these people getting special treatment? And then resentment towards that group grows. And we've seen this. We've seen it over the past 10 years all across Europe and even in America. It's led to the rise of Trump and, Brexit and Farage and all of this stuff, because people are like, well, immigrants or Muslims are getting treated better than natives. And this
right.
leads to
and
resentment.
then and so then it becomes a question of not just trading off the rights of one group, namely oppressed women in conservative Muslim communities, or women who are being forced to compete against biological males in the case of trans athletes, but it's also an own goal for the entire society and even the Muslim community and the trans community themselves, because it leaves a vacuum of persuasion in which people haven't been actually articulating the reasons why we should have a pluralistic multicultural society or why we should do better on trans rights, for example, because you're not having the conversation because it's been ruled out and it's taboo. So the backlash that then emerges is antithetical to all of the aspirations of people who want to live in a multicultural society or who want to live in a society that isn't prejudiced against trans people. But, it's not just it's at the micro and the macro level that everyone loses. I can't remember. I think it was Yasha Monk who talks about the delusion that the left has been laboring under, that they can just sort of force wins and that those wins will be sustainable, instead of doing the hard work of actually trying to persuade people as to why we're right. So, you can contrast the. I
was going to say, I think this is true. I think one of the things is that the left became complacent because it was sort of, it had the entire cultural elite in the palm of its hand at one point. Pretty much every creative intellectual certainly, was left leaning, especially in the 20th century. All the writers, artists were left leaning. Even now, I mean, the overwhelming majority of Hollywood, for example, is left leaning. And, the culture is created by left leaning people, because left leaning people tend to be idealists. They tend to be, imaginative, and, they tend to sort of imagine a better world and all of this stuff, and utopian in that sense. And so I think that the left sort of had this monopoly on culture for a long time. And as a result, it grew complacent, and it started to believe that whatever it put out, whatever content it put out, whatever artistic works it created, that they would be the only voice. But obviously, again, with the internet, what this allowed to happen was it allowed the right to mobilize. Because an interesting thing about the difference between the left and the right, one of the differences is that left-wingers tend to come from cities and right-wingers tend to come from more rural areas. So left-wingers tend to come from very densely packed areas, and right-wingers tend to come from more sparsely populated areas. And what the internet did was that the internet allowed people in sparsely populated areas to mobilize for the first time, because this was very hard to do before the internet. For people in, rural Alabama, for example, to mobilize, it was very difficult because everybody lives far away from each other. The left could easily do this because they were all tightly packed into cities. They came into contact with one another very frequently. So they were able to form protests a lot more frequently and a lot more effectively. What the internet did was it leveled the playing field. It allowed right-wingers to mobilize very quickly at the same speed as the left had formerly been able to do this. And this led to essentially the formation of right-wing culture, which is still very primitive. I would say right-wing culture is very primitive compared to left-wing culture, because right-wing culture is relatively new. It was formerly something that was limited to the backwaters. It was the sort of the dilapidated sort of, rural middle America kind of thing, Rust Belt kind of stuff. But now it's a lot more sophisticated because you have the internet bringing right-wingers together. So we're now seeing the formation of right-wing culture, which is based culture, which is, you're seeing sort of, these organizations like the Babylon Bee and libs of TikTok are forming these kind of new media organizations, and, Daily Wire and all this kind of stuff. And even Fox News is relatively new when it comes to, sort of, big conglomerates of media. I think Fox News was only formed in the late 20th century, I think 1990s, I think. And so,
oh yeah, definitely. I mean, even it's so recent that even CNN. I mean, the idea of having a 24-hour cable news channel that people actually watched was alien until the Gulf War. So what's that? 92? When was the first Gulf War? But I mean,
991,
so that was the first, and So you see, Fox certainly has to be, a decade or so after that. It was probably 9/11 that put it on the map. I mean, the speed of this is incredible. And when you talk about utopian, left-wing, creative, idealistic people, I'm reminded of your amazing piece about your encounter with Luigi Mangione, the suspect of the shooting of the assassination, I guess, of that healthcare CEO, and he had crossed your path because, I mean, just explain that to us. Like, if people aren't aware of his background, I mean, he is a curious, thinker and questioner of the kinds of ideas that we're talking about, the skepticism about institutions, the skepticism about received wisdom. How did he cross your path?
Okay, so I've got to be careful about this because I can't say too much about Luigi Mangione for legal reasons. And also I'm basically contractually obligated because I'm working on a documentary about this. So I can't say too much about it. I can just say that, what I've already said, which is that basically he contacted me via email because he became a founding member to my Substack, the Prism. And, he seemed like a really nice guy. I mean, that's pretty much all I can say about it. He seemed like a nice guy. He seemed pretty normal.
I'm just amazed at in the States. Like just the other day, I heard Bill Maher talk about claiming that he was the shooter and claiming that he was the killer. Like, I mean, in Australia and the UK, if you said that, you'd get a massive fine, and the person and the suspect might walk. But I guess in the States, you just steamroll over all that.
That's it. Yeah, I mean, So with the whole thing with the empathy, I mean, if he did do this, and one of the potential reasons for why he might have done it would be that he believed that he was making the world a better place by killing this person because he believed this person was a villain. And it's interesting because a lot of people justify to themselves that they're doing a good thing, and when they do that, they actually justify some of the most horrific things that a person can do. I mean, when you consider like the atrocities that were committed throughout history, most of them were committed by people who thought they were doing good.
Yeah.
Pretty much any atrocity that you can think of was done by people who thought that they were doing the world a favor, that they were actually making the world a better place. And so a lot of it was also driven by empathy. So it was driven. So if we get to the worst example, or at least the most popular example, the Holocaust, you'd say, how could the Holocaust possibly have been motivated by empathy? That just sounds absurd, doesn't it? But when you really think about it, and when you actually understand Hitler's rationale, it makes perfect sense. So Hitler basically believed he had a lot of empathy for the German people, and especially for the German common man. He was a populist. He believed, he wanted the world to be he wanted the world to be favorable to the basic German citizen. He wanted the basic German citizen to live a good life. And the thing that he thought was the main obstacle to that was Jewish people. He thought that Jewish people obviously were corrupting society through what he called degenerate art. He thought they were essentially engaging in usury, that they were basically taking money away from people, that they were corrupting the youth and all this kind of stuff. And he believed that, he tried to see things from the point of view of the average German citizen who was trying to survive in the wake of, the Treaty of Versailles and, the aftermath of the First World War. And his life was hard for the average German citizen. And he put himself in the average German citizen's shoes and try to work out how to make life better for them. So that's how it actually began. That was how the Holocaust began. From that good intention, that single good intention, it snowballed into this horrific, one of the worst atrocities in human history. It was because he generally wanted to help the German citizen. He had a completely distorted idea of how to do it, but his intentions were good. And you could say the same about Stalin. Stalin wanted to create a better world, and he empathized with the proletariat. He wanted equality. He wanted to, he wanted everybody to be prosperous. And the way that he saw, the best way that he saw to do that was to destroy the bourgeoisie. And so when you look at it like that, it seems, like empathy is actually at the core of a lot of evil in the world. Even today, when you look at the atrocities that are committed by Hamas, for example, you see a lot of people supporting that because they empathize with Hamas. But the interesting thing about empathy...
Well, they probably empathize. They probably think they're empathizing with Palestinians.
With the Palestinians, yeah. And then, so they're empathizing with the Palestinians, I meant, sorry. And, you see the same with Ukraine, you see with Russia, all that stuff, right? The interesting thing, so there's a great book by Paul Bloom called Against Empathy.
Empathy, yeah.
Yeah. And in this book, he makes a very strong case for why empathy leads people to engage in atrocities and horrific acts against people. And one of his arguments is that empathy is actually like a spotlight, that you only shine it on one group or individual at a time. And when you shine it on that group, you submerge everyone around them in darkness. So you cease to have any concern for the people around them, especially the people in opposition to them. And so because empathy is selective in that sense, what it does is you have a lot of empathy, you have a lot of care and a lot of compassion for the object of your empathy. but that means you have none left for the people that are opposing them or whatever. And the truth is that if you have, if you really were an empathic individual, you would be able to have empathy for all individuals to a certain extent. But really what happens is the mind doesn't work like that. People only,
it's
they
fascinating.
have very specific,
Yeah, I've argued with Paul Bloom on this show about the word empathy. I understand the gist of your argument and his, but it strikes me that really what was cruel and callous about Hitler and Stalin was not that they cared too much about the people who were the focus of their self-proclaimed goals, but that there's a streak of idealism which goes along the lines of tough decisions have to be made, and a lot of cowards in this world aren't up to what needs to be done. And this brings us back to Mangione as well. I mean, we don't have to talk about Mangione, but I think there are similarities between, if he did what he is accused of doing, between that mindset and the mindset that I'm trying to articulate, which is like everybody complains about the problem, but nobody is actually willing to step up and do what it takes. And sometimes in order to create a better world, you do have to hold your nose a bit and do things that might on their face seem unseemly. But, it's the Jack Nicholson character in A Few Good Men, or it's Dick Cheney during the War on Terror. It's like, you want to go to bed safe at night, and you don't want to have to think about the things that need to get done in order to ensure your safety and ensure your prosperity. But I alone, this is now channeling Trump. I alone can fix it. And I am the kind of person who will actually have the guts to be able to do that, to make the hard decisions and to do the tough things. And to me, what's so horrendous about the idealism of a Hitler is not that they're overly empathetic towards people. It's that they are overly attached to a utopianism and to a vision. I mean, I agree with you that his actions obviously didn't land as evil to him, but it required a lot of bodies being shoveled, out of gas chambers in order to achieve his vision. And he knew that, but he thought the abstraction of he thought his commitment to an abstraction should trump human concerns. Does that not
absolutely
resonate with you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've written something similar, which is that, idealists become so infatuated with an abstract ideal of humanity that they have no love left for actual humans.
Right.
And,
right.
And I think, because again, this is the idea of sort of, yes. So you're right. Part of it is empathy, but also part of it is seeing too much of a larger picture, seeing this sort of vast image of a future, that sort of blinds them to the present. So, they might be intoxicated by this vision of, a perfect world, and that can blind them to sort of what they're doing in the present. But like at the same time, if you look at people at a population level, then you cease to see them as humans. There's this thing, there's a phenomenon known as compassion fade, which is when you look at large numbers of people, you don't really see them as humans. You see them as sort of like ants, basically. So experiments have been done where what they did was in this one experiment, there was this sort of like, they did split testing with these two marketing campaigns for charity to alleviate poverty, basically, in Africa. And in one campaign, what they did was that they used loads of statistics, like basically about how many people were suffering, and how much of a difference you can make to their lives by sort of giving this amount of money or whatever. And then in the other experiment, what they did was their campaign revolved around a single girl, and she told her story of her life, of how hard it was. And I think the answer to how this went. But the participants gave a lot more money to the girl than they did to the statistics, right?
Yeah,
because they didn't really.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Yeah, they couldn't relate to the
I mean, we know
statistics.
this in our own life as well. Like, I mean, we all know people who are extremely agitated, idealistic activists, and we also know people who are not particularly agitated about big ideas, but are salt of the earth, down to earth people. And if your back was against the wall and you really needed to depend on somebody, and your life was on the line, in whose hands would you rather place your fate? The hands of a keyboard warrior who spends a lot of time being highly agitated about climate change or Gaza on social media, or the slightly racist old farmer? You'd probably go with the slightly racist old farmer, I bet, who probably actually cares about human beings in all of their messiness, rather than some abstract idea of what's going to save humanity in the long run. I want to talk about just finish that thought before I explore other ideas that you've thrown out there.
So I mean, there's a quote that's attributed to Stalin, although he didn't actually say it, which is that one death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic, and I think that really summarizes it. I think one of the problems with when you are a leader of a big nation, you tend to sort of see people as statistics rather than as humans, and that can perhaps be one of the contributors to atrocities as well. You just don't see them as humans.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Another piece that I want to pick your brain on is the pathologization pandemic. The idea that in the 21st century, we're kind of confusing sadness for sickness in a way, that there's like a trend of, I don't know, mistaking deep spiritual unfulfillment and anomie with a pathology. Can you unpack that?
Yeah, so, I mean, this is originally something that I sort of came across when I was looking at some of the long COVID statistics. And because I was quite interested in the phenomenon of long COVID, I was wondering what it was. And one of the things that
What is it? Is it a
me,
thing, by the way? Can you get to the punchline?
It's a thing, but it's actually more accurate to say that it's a collection of things. So it's an umbrella term that's used for sort of long-term consequences of COVID infection. And this could range from depression to actual damage that's been done to perhaps the lungs. Autoimmune reactions is probably one of the major ones as well. Autoimmune problems as a result of COVID infection are a major class of long COVID. And then there's people who believe that they have long COVID, but don't. And this is very interesting because when I looked at who actually was suffering from long COVID, or who was at least claiming to suffer from long COVID, what I found was that in the hospital statistics, a large number of the people who claimed to have long COVID had no evidence of COVID antibodies in their blood serum, which means that they very, very likely didn't have COVID ever. So it's impossible to have, I mean, you shouldn't really be able to have long COVID unless you've had COVID. But there are a large number of people who had long COVID without ever having COVID. And so what became clear to me was when I looked further into the statistics, what I found was that a large number of the people who had long COVID but didn't have COVID had anxiety or depression or some other mood disorder before the pandemic. And so it became clear to me that a large proportion of people, and not all, obviously I'm not saying that long COVID is fake. Obviously there are people out there who do have real conditions and, autoimmune disorders and all that kind of stuff. I'm not saying that they're faking it. What I'm saying is that there is a large proportion of people who claim to have long COVID who actually have some other disorder. So it could be anxiety, it could be depression, it could be some other kind of mood disorder. And what they've done is that they've read up about long COVID. They've read the symptoms of long COVID. They've applied some of the symptoms themselves. They've seen they're engaging in confirmation bias again. And they're sort of ignoring the symptoms that they have, which are not part of long COVID. And they're fixating on the ones that they do have, which are part of long COVID. And then they're basically ascertaining from that. They're basically concluding from that, rather, that they have long COVID. And this is allowing them essentially to identify as a long COVID patient. And so this was how I originally came across this idea that people might mistake their disorders, but it could be something that's not even really an illness, but something like depression. I mean, I suppose depression is an illness, but it's vague illness. Depression is a spectrum, and it can range from mild sadness to actual suicidal sort of thoughts. And so, people were mistaking mood disorders for physiological disorders. And then what I did is I basically began to look at some of the literature, and I found that there's actually a long history of this. In fact, there's a very interesting idea where I think, hang on, let me just try to remember what this was. So there was a condition where people thought they were made of glass, right? And it was known as, I think, glass delusion, right? And this was very popular in Europe in the 15th to 17th centuries. And King Charles VI of France was famously afflicted by the glass delusion. He wore clothing that was reinforced with iron rods and did not allow his advisors to come near him due to his fear that his body would accidentally shatter. He may have been the first known case, actually. He's one of the most famous cases of this case. So this was something that spread quite a lot. People thought they were made of glass. And this is just one. There was another one, which was the dancing delusion, where people would dance and they would feel the need to dance until they died of exhaustion, apparently. So there have been some strange illnesses throughout history. And what they show is that a lot of illnesses are psychogenic. They're not a result of physiological changes in the body. They're actually, at least not initially, they're actually a result of psychological changes. So that they stem from the way somebody thinks. It's possible that if you think in a certain way, you can make yourself ill. And this has been shown again and again and again and again throughout history. There's been strange pandemics. In India, there's something called puppy pregnancy syndrome, where people actually become so convinced that they've been impregnated by a puppy. Basically, in rural India, there's this idea that if you get bitten by a pregnant dog, that you become pregnant with puppies, basically. Wow. And this is such a powerful illusion that people who have this, who believe that they're pregnant with puppies, will actually begin to display some of the symptoms of being pregnant. For example, they'll vomit a lot. They'll have a lot of nausea. They'll, have exhaustion, and they'll, suffer from actual real physiological effects. And so,
and when they finally give birth to a litter of puppies, then that's the effect going overboard.
Yeah. And so this was very interesting to me because I then realized that the people who are claiming to have long COVID probably actually do have something that feels a lot like long COVID, because they believe that they have long COVID. And when you believe sufficiently that you have an illness, you actually can begin to feel ill. And I began to sort of look at this, as something that is becoming a lot more common in the age of social media. Because if, as we know, the glass delusion, puppy pregnancy syndrome, mass hysteria, the dancing syndrome, all of these really bizarre diseases that have occurred throughout history, they spread through social contagion. So somebody would say that they had this illness, and they would say that you could catch it, and then that would lead somebody else to believe that they'd caught it, and then they would then have this psychological illness, and then they would spread it to somebody else. So it was like an actual disease. It was spreading, except it was spreading through the mind rather than through the body. And I thought that if that's the case, then in the age of social networks, this is going to be a much bigger problem. And I think I'm right there, because I found evidence that the prevalence of many, many different disorders has increased. So anxiety has, generalized anxiety disorder has increased. Social anxiety disorder has increased. Depression has increased. Autism spectrum disorders of various kinds have increased. Gender dysphoria has massively increased. There's been huge numbers of these psychological ailments that have increased in prevalence in the literature, in the medical literature. And it doesn't make sense that this is a physiological phenomenon, because humans have actually become healthier. We have better diets than we had 50 years ago, 100 years ago. People have a better awareness of medical disorders now than they did 50, 100 years ago. One of the things is that there's something called medicalization, which is that the threshold for something to be classed as a medical issue has been lowered. So what was considered normal shyness in the 1960s, for example, is now social anxiety disorder, right? So if you were just shy, you just didn't want to be around people, that was just a normal thing. Now it's not normal. Now it's a medical issue. And there are many reasons for why this has happened, why things have become more and more medicalized. One of the reasons for this is that there are incentives for the medical industry to class more and more things as medical disorders, because obviously that makes them more money. If you're just shy, you can't make money from a shy person. But if somebody has social anxiety disorder, you can give them drugs, so
of course,
you can make
and this
a lot
is
more
even
money.
true with physiological things, like when Viagra was discovered and the drug company was like, well, I mean, guys get older, it goes a bit limper, and then they were like, no, that's not the case. There's a disease called erectile dysfunction, and now we can actually treat this this disease.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. It does strike me though that there are probably several possible explanations for the increase in anxiety and
there are,
depression.
Absolutely.
Right? It doesn't have to be a contagion. It could be the fact that people are getting bullied and are losing social connections and are on social media too much.
I think a contagion is a big part of it. I think a contagion is a big part of it. It's not the only explanation, but I think it's a major explanation. There are many explanations. I mean, one of the other explanations would be that they're actually genuinely, for example, with autism, this could actually be a result of pollution. So microplastics, hormonal, endocrine disruptors, and all of this stuff. Some people have speculated this could be one of the reasons. Another could be that, people are living more sedentary lives than they used to. So, that's obviously very unhealthy. And then there's, I think, medicalization, which is, when we just lower the threshold of what is considered a medical disorder, is definitely one of the big things. Concept creep is another one. Concept creep is linked to medicalization. But I think that social contagion
just explain concept creep.
So concept creep is the loosening of a definition of a word over time, as it pertains to some harm. So, for example, what was considered racist 50 years ago was a lot more narrower than what's considered racist now. What was considered sexual harassment 50 years ago was a lot more narrower than what's considered now. What was considered poverty 50 years ago was a lot narrower in definition than what's considered now. And one of the reasons for concept creep is that as social problems get solved, there is a need to redefine those problems, to make them larger, so that they continue to have equal social weight, and that the people that are in charge of trying to resolve these issues have something to do. So,
yes, I mean, I'm always accused of being a bad gay because I have this attitude towards like gay rights as well. I mean, I'm married to a guy, and yet I basically feel like every major concession has been won in modern progressive democracies, and so LGBTQIA plus groups have to keep inventing new reasons for their own existence and funding by making some heteronormative evil bigger than it is.
And you see it, for example, with sort of how racism became systemic racism, and then there's all these new forms of racism like microaggressions and cultural appropriation and all this new stuff that's been invented because the old racism is going away. And
there was a supply problem. There weren't enough racists.
Exactly.
We needed more racists to get angry about.
Exactly. Yes. So I think concept creep is definitely part of it as well. But I definitely think that social contagion is a major part of why we're seeing a rise in the prevalence of these disorders. And the reason for this is because there is a big, massive culture now online, which is specifically about mental disorders. And we're seeing on TikTok, for example, the rise of something called various things called sad fishing, which is basically where people go online and they claim to have certain problems in order to gain sympathy from their followers. And it's a good way to increase your clout. And one of the ways that people try to increase their clout and increase sympathy for themselves is by claiming that they have some kind of disorder. And there's been a bit of a problem, a bit of an epidemic on TikTok, especially, where people will claim that they have multiple personality disorder, or where they will claim to have autism spectrum disorder, or even like, it could just be depression or anxiety, or in some cases, Tourette's syndrome. Tourette's syndrome is actually a very popular one. because it's very entertaining
Mm.
for people to watch. It might not be entertaining to have it, but it's entertaining for other people to watch. And so a lot of people on TikTok,
it's also something that's unfalsifiable to the outsider.
exactly.
Right? Like there's no way
Yeah.
you
Or at
can't accuse
least,
someone of not having.
well, there's an interesting thing here, actually, about its falsifiability, because, there was this one case of this lady called Tix and Roses. She was a pretty popular TikToker, and she claimed to have Tourette's for a long period of time, and she grew a pretty big following based on her Tourette's. And then an old video surfaced of her talking normally, and then her mother came out and said, well, she doesn't actually have Tourette's, she's just been making it all up. And obviously that was the end of her Tourette's career. But like, there have been a few cases of this happening. But what's very interesting about the Tourette's thing is that there's actually, in the medical literature, there's a case known as Tourette's, known as TikTok tics. And the TikTok tics are basically the case of people presenting to medical clinics with symptoms of Tourette's syndrome who previously didn't have Tourette's and who have spent a lot of time on TikTok and have basically gained Tourette's from watching people pretending to have Tourette's on TikTok. So this is spread like a virus. So what happens is you get people pretending to have Tourette's on TikTok. They gain a big following. People watch these videos, especially this is particularly prominent amongst young girls. For some reason, young girls are particularly prone to this. They will watch these videos and then they will start to develop TikTok tics, basically Tourette's tics, artificially. And so this is a sign that the mechanism that I was saying by which these contagions are spreading through social networks, this is real evidence that this is happening. You know?
Yeah,
And
I mean, we're just
think,
fucked, aren't we? I mean, really, at this stage, like, young girls are uniquely vulnerable to social contagion and always have been. And now we've got TikTok tics and, you know, incredible rises in gender dysphoria. I mean, I hope that you're right that social contagion explains a significant portion of things like anxiety and depression. My fear is that they're more pronounced in things like gender dysphoria than they are with anxiety, and that the anxiety is real, because we're depriving people of having the lived experience of interacting with other human beings in the flesh and bumping into each other, and they're constantly, I mean, the performativity of it all is also so corrosive. The amount of, and you've written about this as well, the amount of time that we now spend in our lives not living, but watching ourselves live for the benefit of how we will appear to other people. It's unprecedented. Like the idea that you're constantly going to have this avatar of yourself on your shoulder, second guessing everything you do in order to curate it for other people's perception, even when they're not around, has got to do something to you.
Yeah, absolutely. It's, I think one of the problems, in fact, I'm actually working on an article about this. One of the interesting things about the internet is it fundamentally disorients people from reality, like the very structure of the internet. I'm not talking about any particular piece of information online, but the very format of the internet itself. So there's this interesting, the history of casino development might not seem like something's quite relevant, but it's actually very relevant. So, so there's basically the original casinos were designed to essentially confuse people. So for example, one thing you've probably heard is that, you know, casinos don't have windows and they don't have clocks. And one of the reasons for this is that they don't want you to know what time it is, basically. Because if you know what time it is, you might be late and you might feel, oh, I need to leave this casino now. And, you know, I might, or, you know, you're kind of, it's basically a way to sort of distance you from reality. And another thing,
you might realize that you've been there for 3.5 hours and you need to go home and feed the kids. That wouldn't.
Yeah, exactly. And another thing about casinos is, there's another design cue that they use in casinos, which is that they tend not to have right angle turns in casinos. And you'll have noticed this if you've been to a casino, where the paths tend to curve slowly rather than having sharp turns. And the reason for this is that when you reach a right angle, when you reach a junction, that forces you to make a decision. You have to decide whether you're going to go left or whether you're going to go right or whether you're going to go straight. And that activates the part of your brain responsible for agency and decision making. And so you're taking charge of your life by doing that. And they don't want you to take charge of your life. They want you to be passive. And so they make their paths slowly curving so that you just gently follow the curve and you don't have to make a decision about where you're going. And another thing that they do is they use something called the Gruen effect, which is also used in supermarkets, which is that they make it like a maze. They make the paths like a maze, and they position the exits and the toilets and other necessities in certain places where you have to the way to get to them, you have to pass through loads of amusement arcade machines, craps tables, whatever. You have to pass through a lot of distractions in order to get where you're going. Supermarkets do this by putting everyday items like bread and milk and eggs right at the back of the supermarket. So you have to go through the entire supermarket to get your everyday items, and that can lead you astray and cause you to buy much more than you had intended to buy. Casino use these methods to essentially divorce people from reality and to essentially shut off their brains. And what's interesting is that the internet works a lot like that. It works a lot like a casino. In fact, it uses many of the same techniques, sometimes advertently, sometimes not, but it uses many of the same techniques. So, for example, the idea about the paths not having right angle turns, right, is analogous to YouTube having an autoplay feature. Because when you stop playing it and you have to click on another video, that's the part where you have to engage the decision-making part of your brain. You have to take agency over your life. Whereas if it autoplays, you don't need to make a decision. You could just sit there and wait for the next video. And that's why TikTok's so popular. It's at least one reason why TikTok is so popular is that it's an autoplay. It's basically, you don't have to do anything when you go on TikTok. You don't have to click on anything. You just open TikTok and it starts playing videos, and then you just sit there. You don't have to scroll. You don't have to like. You don't have to reply. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to favorite. It just basically will play video after video after video without you have to make any decision. And the same thing is true with what the internet does to your sense of time. So we know that a human sense of time is sort of dictated by the light and dark cycle. So, we have a part of our brain called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which was responsible for the production of melatonin. And melatonin is obviously responsible for regulating the sleep-wake cycle. And this is actually more broadly involved in the ability of humans to dictate time. There's been experiments that have been done where they would put people in artificial light in environments without any windows, without any clocks, and they would try to get them to estimate how long has passed. And people tend to just be wildly off. They tend to have absolutely no idea of how much time has passed. And the reason for this is because of the light, because the lack of natural light causes the sort of the brain's internal clock to malfunction. Now, here's the thing. When you're online, you're looking at a bright screen, and that bright screen is generating a lot of blue light. And that blue light is artificial light, and it confuses your brain, and it interferes with the production of melatonin. And this can destroy your sense of time. And this is why when you're on social media and you're browsing the internet and you're mindlessly scrolling through your feed or whatever, you completely lose track of time. It's one of the reasons why you lose complete track of time. When you don't have a good idea of what's going on with time, everything else falls apart, because obviously time is the thing that gives life order. When you don't have a sense of time, you don't have a sense of anything really. And so it leads to mental chaos. So this is one of the problems, is that we're living in a world where natural light is gradually being extinct. If you go outside on a dark night, there's street lights everywhere, even the shine of they're so strong that you can't even sometimes see the stars. And most people now are spending so long on their phones that the natural sort of system of timekeeping in their brains is being continually overridden, and it's malfunctioning as a result. And people are losing track. And
I mean, yeah, and I mean, you have to add to this the fact that we have very clever software engineers who are devising algorithms that rope us in and grab. It's not just that we're looking at a bright screen, but that, as you say, in the case of YouTube or TikTok, those bright screens are devised with only one goal in mind, which is to maximize our time on the site by feeding us things that are going to arouse us and want us to continue to be engaged by them. It's fucking evil.
Yeah, the problem is that because it's disorientating people, they're not even aware of what's actually happening to them, because the thing that's happening to them is preventing them from knowing what's happening to them, And so it's like, it's one of the reasons why I try not to spend so much time on the internet. I mean, I was addicted to the internet at one point. I was addicted to social media. I was spending so long on social media. But now I hardly ever go on social media now, because I find that it interferes with, just basic things like timekeeping. And when you don't have a sense of time, then you become very, very easily manipulable to others. It's very easy to spend your whole day being outraged about something going on in the news, because you're not really paying attention to what's actually going on in the real world, because your sense of time has completely gone. And one of the interesting things about the lack of natural light basically suppresses the production of melatonin. And what's very interesting is that when you have dopamine actually causes time to slow down perceptually, and serotonin causes time to speed up perceptually. And what happens is that when you're engaged in routine behaviors, such as just mindlessly scrolling social media, your dopamine actually drops. And so your time actually speeds up perceptually while you're on social media, because you enter essentially like a kind of dissociative state where you're not really paying attention to what you're looking at. But what's happening is time's actually speeding up perceptually. So you're losing time by going on social media. But if you engage in novel behaviors actually increase dopamine in the brain. And dopamine, and there have been experiments that have been done on, for example, people watching basketball games, where what they found was that dopamine levels increase when surprise occurs. So, for example, if somebody's watching a basketball game and they're supporting a certain team, and this could be negative surprise or positive surprise. So if they're, watching a basketball game and somebody scores out of nowhere, that leads to a surge in dopamine. And this can happen whether that person who scored is on your team, the team that you support, or not on that team that you support. So it's positive surprise and negative surprise. And so novelty is linked to dopamine production, which is linked to the slowing down of time. And apparently, according to, and this was, again, I think Andrew Huberman has talked about this, where basically, if you want to slow down time, if you want to make more out of your day, you want to increase the dopamine in your brain. And the way that you do that is by having more novel activities. So not engaging in routine behaviors, but doing new things and surprising yourself. And so the equivalent of that would be to spend less time engaging in rote social media, sort of scrolling, doom scrolling, and to engage in new things. So if you are going to spend time on the internet, go to a website you've never been to before and read news sites that you've never ever read before. Watch a completely different video to the one that you'd normally try to watch. And that will actually slow down time and actually make you feel like you've done more in a day, and you'll have probably a better sense of time.
We've all had this experience, right? I mean, we've all had the experience of, you pick up your phone and it's 23 minutes past 7 and you need to, get out the door by 7:45, and before you know it, it's 7:44 and it feels like only 3 minutes has passed by. I mean, the on the question of being sort of directed in ways by other people or by powerful forces like the casino designers, there's a book called Nudge by Cass Sunstein and Richard Taylor. Do you know this? About the way that public policy can actually harness people for their own betterment. In the classic example is whether or not you have to opt in or by default are opted in to organ donation. You can have exactly the same cohort of people, and the simple opt-in, whether or not the default is set at opt-in or opt-out, will have a massive impact on the amount of uptake, just because you're being nudged in that direction rather than having to make a proactive choice. I will note that in the interests of maintaining my own light sanity and time, I will have to go in a few minutes and put my children to bed.
Yeah.
That being said, the last thing I want to touch on is one of your most popular pieces is about the gamification of everything, about everything becoming a game, and this probably leads us into that. Do you want to just reflect on that and explain this thesis before we go?
Yeah, so gamification is the application of game-like mechanics to non-game activities. So in other words, it's turning things that are not games into games, often to get people addicted to them, or at least to make people do them. And we've seen a rise of this since the early 20th century, but it's really kicked off, in the 21st century. So the original examples would be, frequent flyer air mile tickets, house points for Boy Scouts. These are point systems. So, if you do a good deed, you get a point. And if you get a certain number of points, then you get a reward. So this is one of the most basic forms of gamification. This was very popular during, the 20th century, and then McDonald's did it, with certain things. And they had, the Happy Meals where, if you collect enough Happy Meals, you get all these different toys, you get a wide range. You get a toy in every Happy Meal. So then you want to collect them. So this was originally done in the 20th century. What happened was that with the sort of the digital age and the digital revolution, gamification came into its own, because what the digital age allowed people to do was to keep score, essentially. If you have a phone in your pocket, you can always keep score of pretty much anything at any time. You can carry it around with you. You can always know what the score is. And so as a result of this, people began to work on ways in which they could gamify apps so they could make you use them more. And the first big example of this was Facebook. So Facebook was basically at sort of, it created the like button. I think this was around 2008 where they created the like button. And the purpose of the like button was to essentially create a point system so that every post that you post gets a certain number of likes based on how good the post is. And if it gets loads of likes, then it gets shared to more people. So, there's like a cascade effect. And, you gain status as a result of this. And so this was one of the reasons, I think, why Facebook really took off, and also why this method was copied by a lot of other websites that came after, such as Twitter with its likes and followers and all that kind of stuff. And what's happened is, since then, the success of social media after gamification has been so profound that now tech giants are looking at gamifying pretty much everything, because they just know that if you can turn something into a game, you can make people want to do that thing. So it's a great way to control behavior. Instead of, the old method of forcing people to do things, or making them scared, fearing them into doing things, you can actually just make them fun. You can make an activity fun, and you can get people to do what you want by doing that. And so now we're seeing things like Temu, for example. Temu is like the sort of Chinese Amazon, and it's become extremely popular over the past few years. As a result,
Temu is technically it's the Temu Amazon. I mean, it's now in the lexicon. When something is like an ersatz version of something else, you say it's a Temu version of it because it's so crappy and tacky. But yeah, incredible.
But it's so
incredible
popular
that people want to be harassed and harangued by an app the way that it does. It's the same with Duolingo and things like that, which gamify the experience.
And dating apps and everything, yeah. So, this has gotten a lot worse with AI now as well. I mean, because now AI can sort of build up a profile of you based on your inputs, and they can use that to sort of make the game more addictive for you. And so, we're seeing sort of like dating apps, for example, if you message a certain number of possible matches, then you gain like these virtual flower bouquets that you can send to your matches and things like that. So gamification is occurring in the digital world. Amazon have this strange thing where with their workers in their warehouses, where it tracks how fast you're packaging things. So everybody's package rate is displayed on a massive leaderboard in the warehouse that everybody can see. So it's in your interests to maintain your status in order to basically be as fast as you can, to package things as fast as you can. And then your rate goes higher and higher. And then when you're at the top, then you become like the star, you become the MVP, and you gain special rewards as a result of that. And it's been done in the real world as well, like generally speaking. I mean, we see it in the social credit system in China. Or at least I should say the social credit systems, because there's not one. There's actually very many different social credit systems in China, all in different areas of different parts of China. And So in a couple of different parts. So in towns and cities such as Guangzhou and Rongcheng in China, there are actually leaderboards in the middles of the streets. Just as, like we have billboards or whatever, they have leaderboards. And you can just walk past these. These are just naturally just in the streets, so for anybody can see them. And what these leaderboards show is they show who is the best citizen based on, how quickly they pay their taxes, and whether they are law abiding, whether they keep things clean and tidy, all these little things. They give you points for that, and so there's like a leaderboard of like who's the best citizen. So they've actually gamified being a good citizen. And this is pretty dystopic because
this is like my household with my 7-year-old children, where I'm like, if you clean up your room, then I'm going to give you a tick on the fridge, and then you get enough ticks, and I'll buy you a candy. It's infantilizing. It's ridiculous.
Exactly, but the problem is that it works. It works, and because people like fun, and this has been proven to work now. Like, I mean, in so many different spheres, in sort of like. In environmentalism, for example, there were experiments that were done by Volkswagen where they did this sort of campaign where they basically try to make environmentalism fun. So one example was that they, in order to get people to use the stairs, this was actually for health. So in order to get people to use the stairs rather than use an elevator, what they did is they turned the stairs into piano keys, so that you can play a tune as you're running up the stairs. And this actually worked. It increased the number of people. Yeah. It increased the number of people using stairs by 60%. And I think they did do some stuff with, there was, I think, one example. I don't know if this was actually implemented. I think it was, but there was a lottery, a speed cam lottery in Sweden, where what would happen is that basically whenever you, drive at the limit and you pass the speed cam at the limit, or below the limit, the speed limit, you'd get certain points, and you basically get inducted into a raffle. And what happens is that if you win the raffle, you win the prize money, and the prize money is made from the fines of people who were over the limit, basically. So, it's like an extra incentive to, So, there's all these different sort of ways to gamify, sort of thing. And it's also been used to find, to do science. There was, I think it was at the University of Washington. At the University of Washington, there was a group of biochemists, and they were trying to identify the structure of I think it was an AIDS virus protein, I think. And they didn't know how to do it. They tried to do it for many years. And so eventually what they decided to do was to turn it into a game. And they gave it out they turned it into a game, and they gave it to like loads of students to try to do it. They gave it to some professional video game players as well. And the structure of the protein was solved within 2 weeks. Because
amazing.
It was, it shows the power.
We have these big intellectual conversations about whether or not we're all living in a simulation, but we're actually just living in a video game of our own making, regardless, even in the physical world. It's fascinating to scratch the surface of some of these things. If people are interested in your work, then I highly recommend the Prism, which is a fabulous Substack, and you go much, much, much deeper than we've been able to in this limited time. But thanks for giving us a glimpse into it. It's great to talk to you.
It's been a pleasure, Josh. Thank you.